My dear sisters and brothers, good evening. Welcome to Wednesday Wellness. Sisters and brothers, we gather here every Wednesday, usually at 6:30, but this is a special edition. We're meeting at 6:15. We're here to offer help and hope, faith and fellowship. This is a time to cast burdens aside during this pandemic time. On behalf of all the good and marvelous people at the Central United Methodist Church, where I am pleased to be senior pastor, Angela Johnson is our associate pastor. We're so very, very glad that you're going to be with us and spend this time with us this very special evening. Our guest tonight is the Reverend Dr. James M. Lawson. He's the son and the grandson of Methodist preachers. He has been clergy for 70 years. He is not merely a colleague, a peer, he's a friend of the late Martin Luther King Jr. And Dr. King said about him, and hear this, that James Lawson was, quote, the mind of the movement. He said James Lawson is the greatest teacher of nonviolence in America. He has few, if any, equals when it comes to scholarship and the lifestyle of nonviolent direct social action. He counts my former member, Ernest Rip Patton, Diane Nash, Dr. Bernard Lafayette, the late James Bevel, the late Mayor of Washington, D.C., Marion Barry, and the late, great congressional representative, the Honorable John Lewis, amongst his students. Dr. Lawson is an activist, more than that, an author, more than that, a scholar, more than that, a professor, more than that, a strategist. Oh, but more than all of those, Reverend Dr. James Lawson is a pastor of over 70 years, and for over 60 years, he's been married to his dear wife, Dorothy. I'm honored, again, as he preached for us this past Sunday and was riveting. I'm honored and blessed to welcome tonight to Wednesday Wellness, Dr. James M. Lawson, Jr.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Welcome, Dr. Lawson. Thank you so very, very much for being with us. We're so honored and humbled to have you here. By the way, family, those who are watching, we're going to have questions for a little while. We'll call later for you to put questions in the chat box, the comment section, excuse me. And we look forward to sharing some of those with you. We're going to talk with Dr. Lawson for just a couple of seconds now. First, Dr. Lawson, tell us, how is your wife and how are you?
Dorothy is doing better, slowly, but doing better, and I'm fine.
Good. We're very glad to hear that. Would you please give her our fondest regards and our deepest affections and love?
I'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Lawson, we want to get into this as I begin sharing. I'd like to ask you, there's a story of your first encounter with racism as a young lad with a peer and a conversation later with your mother. Would you share that with us?
Well, I'll tell quickly two stories. First, my father moved to the St. James AME Zion Church on my shortly after my fourth birthday when I was 4. We moved into Tremont Street. I'm not sure if it was a parsonage or what, but in any case, it was a street where black and white families lived together in a several blocks area. So white and black playmates, and we lived next door to each other, all of that. Very, very peculiar, one of the scenes in America that's forgotten about. In any case, on Tremont Street, I encountered my first racist experience when I was kind of taken by surprise when a white neighbor my age suddenly turned on me as we were walking up the street or playing in the street and used a racist epithet on me. To this day, I'm not sure why, but when he did it, I responded with my fist and slapping him. The details of that I do not know. So that's my first encounter in racism in Northeast Ohio, which helped to make me recognize that racism has always been a national problem. It's not been located just in Montgomery, Alabama. Well, in the fourth grade, the same experience happened with another person on the main street of Massillon, Ohio. And I was on an errand for my mother, and I finished the errand after I'd slapped this child and ran home. And for some reason, this time, and the only time I remember ever talking to my mother or father about such incidents, I told her about the encounter on Main Street and my response to it. And without raising her voice, she asked me simply, Jimmy, what good did that do? And after a long soliloquy, she then said there must be a better way. So in that experience, which I later came to understand to be a numinous experience, a life-changing experience, I heard myself making the decision that never again on the playing field or in any such encounter would I use my fist on anybody, would I fight at all. I would find a different way of handling it. And then I also heard myself making the decision I would find a better way. And my mother, in her talk to me, did, of course, refer to the love of God and the love of God through Jesus, and our being a part of a church where there was a great amount of love demonstrated in our family, where we loved one another, that all this form of love was sufficient for us to find the right way to handle these issues. So that's the encounter, and that launched me in a more serious examination. I'm in the fourth grade, mind you. This launches me into a more serious examination in Sunday school and in the scriptures, which I was reading by that time easily, a study of Jesus and what it meant, therefore, to follow Jesus, and what life of Jesus what I could learn about Jesus that would direct my discovery how to handle this matter.
With all that love in the home that you spoke of, and the love in the church, but a society so saturated in violence, how did you at that young age negotiate all that through your study? What buoyed you? What was it that steeled and strengthened you to be able to do that?
Well, I suppose basically being in that family and being people of faith, the faith itself strengthened me or encouraged me to do the work I began or I continued. So I don't see that as an important issue. As I look back upon all of this, I know that I had already a profound awareness that I belonged to God and to life. That my mother and father and my sisters and brothers were anchors of love. So I was already very strong in my sense of being a human being and being committed to that journey, as I remember.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Being strong in that connection. For you in the fourth grade, you move on. You graduate high school and go to college. Go to Baldwin Wallace, and there, conscription to the military comes upon you, and you refuse it. Can you say something about that refusal, your sense of life and being, and how that all connects?
well, that comes out of the whole experience of seeing racism and racial prejudice, which by the time I was in high school, I knew I would always resist, that I would obey no racial prejudice. I would obey no Jim Crow laws. So that was done by high school. I was convinced that racist laws were unjust, unfair, in contradiction to uh, Jesus, and that therefore I would not obey them. I did not know how I would disobey them, but I would not follow them. I would accept no forms of racism. So that was staunchly in my head and heart by the time I hit high school. In high school, I became aware of anti Semitism, and I recognized that in following Jesus, there could be no such stuff as anti Semitism. That whatever this was about, it was wrong. I also, in especially my second year in high school, came up against the fear and Protestant biases against Roman Catholic students in my school, Jewish students in my school. So I came out against, personally, I determined in my journey with Jesus, I would not be religiously biased about people. I would not take this nonsense that my religion is better than your religion, or your religion is better than my religion, and so forth and so on. So, all that is a prelude in high school then to the 19. I graduated in 1946 from high school. I turned 18 in September. In September, turning 18 meant I had to register for the Selective Service Act. I registered at age 18. In the single sheet that you use for registration, I put around the margins that I did not know if I should be registering, that I was thinking this out as a follower of Jesus, but that in the meantime, I was going to obey the Draft Act. Though I was not certain that was the right way for me to go. Well, in 47, 48, in college, I began to realize that the Draft Act, Selective Service, was an unjust law that I should not obey. Now, remember, in that Selective Service Act, as a student, that could be deferred. As a pre-ministerial student, I could be deferred. I could sign up as a conscientious objector and be deferred. But I preferred the path of direct confrontation with what I considered to be an unjust act.
Dr. Lawson, at what point did that not assume for you some danger?
Well, I was reading the Bible, and I was reading especially Gospels of Jesus and the New Testament. And so I recognized that in following Jesus, I could get hurt. I recognized that often I could even end up in jail in my college years. I realized that. But consequences of following Jesus was not for me an issue. To follow Jesus meant that you could be vulnerable and in danger and so forth and so on. But that was the consequence of my primary biblical and spiritual mantra that I heard the voice of God through Jesus say, "Follow me." And that meant for me, I would do so. I would follow. Whatever that represented, I would try to do my best to follow Jesus. So, consequences in one way were irrelevant to me. Uh, in this, as long as I was convinced I was on the right path in following Jesus.
Oh my. We're Sister
So,
Rebecca, this
so
is
the consequences. I mean, I was, I had friends in college and student meetings and all of that kind of stuff, and I had folk who would, you say, well, you're taking a risk and you ruin your life and all that kind of stuff. I heard that. Conscientious objection, pacifism was heavily talked about in the Methodist student movement. So these were current issues in all kinds of student meetings on campus and and state meetings and conference meetings and district meetings. Racism and war were two of the hectic issues in the Methodist Church and among young people in those years between about 46 to 52, 53. Scared the church, in fact.
oh my, Dr. Lawson. Let me interject here. This is Wednesday Wellness. We're with Dr. James Lawson. We're discussing his life and ministry. Dr. Lawson, you just mentioned the Methodist student movement,
Yeah.
and you talked about the strength of a stealing of faith. Help us understand, what does that mean? What did that mean for your life and your faith? The Methodist student movement, local church, district, conference, etc.
Well, the Methodist Youth Fellowship and the Methodist Student Movement were two very strong structures in United Methodism at that time, and that encouraged us to conscientiously follow the path of Jesus. That urged us to develop the spiritual life, the prayer life, the biblical life. So they were two very strong teaching tools, rather, in my life in the uh, late 40s and 50s and 60s and beyond. And as I said, two very important topics in camps, summer training activities, in winter or spring meetings of the student movement in Ohio. These were major kinds of topics that concerned the discussion. So,
This this sounds like it had a profound impact on you. You just said a moment ago that it scared the church. Say more about what that means. It scared the church.
well, I traveled into all kinds of Methodist student meetings, regional, state conference, national, and I met all kinds of students, north, south, east, west, a number of whom became my lifelong colleagues. And two major topics in the National Conference of Methodist Youth, of which I was an officer for 3 or 4 years, the race segregation, and Jesus and war and peace were very hot issues. I met high school and college students, white, from the Midwest and from the Southeastern area, who were in trouble in their local churches and with their pastors because they had come to the conclusion that Jesus was not a racist and did not permit them to be racist. I met people who, in fact, were being shunned in their local churches over the issue of race in the Methodist Church. I'm not going to name names, but I do remember names.
Oh my.
One person who, in fact, was shunned by his family, his pastor, and in spite of that, he went on to theological school and became a Methodist preacher.
Oh my.
I know the name. I mean,
My.
okay, and so there was in the 40s and 50s into the 60s a study process, spiritual process going on in the church in which young people were disassociating themselves from racism, segregation because of their developing, emerging faith in Jesus of Nazareth and knew that they were going to follow him or that were trying to follow him. So in the 60s, this scared the southeastern jurisdiction so much that in the 60s, in the General Conference, they wiped out the 15 to 20 professional members of the Department of the Board of Education who did nothing but specialize in youth and student work across the country.
These were staff members?
Yeah, we had 15 to 20 people in a professional staff of lay educators and clergy who worked out of Nashville, who did nothing but work on to see to it that MYFs were in every church and that bishops and district superintendents and pastors did youth ministry. And this is how, in many conferences across this country, we built up summer camp conferences. We bought camps in the 20th century, in the first part of the 20th century, where we could have these sizable youth meetings, small and large, of young people, where students could gather for conferences, and where we heard, they brought in theological people, and I mean people from our theological schools, and preachers and teachers who would lead us in Bible study, lead us in preaching and teaching and education and in small workshops. And it was a powerful instrument of evangelism.
My.
And the southeastern jurisdiction, because of the growing, emerging rebellion of kids against segregation in the southeastern jurisdiction, cut out the entire youth and student staff, professional staff that worked out of the Board of Education, worked as a part of the Board of Education in doing that work. And so in wiping it out, they wiped out, therefore, a major source of membership in United Methodist Church. And membership began to decline. Because if you're evangelizing among children and young people and students, you are allowing yourself to be engaged with God in capturing youth to follow Jesus. And most of those people joined churches when they finished college. If they did not go back to their local communities, they joined Methodist churches in other parts of the country. It was a primary source of membership in United Methodist Church.
Dr. Lawson.
And it was wiped out. And I've never seen this story in any United Methodist periodical. So when they talk to me today about losing membership, I know why we're losing membership. Because we didn't want these white students in the southeastern jurisdiction questioning war and questioning racism.
Dr. Lawson, all this is happening in the crucible of the church.
Yes.
After the 1939 Union that
Oh yes, absolutely. Look, I stayed in white Methodist homes in Texas, Mississippi, Tennessee, during those years as I visited conferences, youth meetings, and student meetings. In 1953, while I was waiting to go to India, waiting for my visa to go to India as a short-term missionary in India, the Texas Methodist Student Movement invited me, and in February and March, I toured University Methodist Student Movement centers, SMU. I stayed on SMU campus. They had just Nigel Riley and Cecil Williams had just become students at the School of Theology at SMU. I stayed on that campus. That was my headquarters. I traveled to University of Texas Prairie View. I'm not sure how many colleges, but I did maybe 6 weeks, 8 weeks of this traveling and staying with white families wherever I went.
Oh my! For those who don't know, this is Wednesday Wellness with Dr. Jim Lawson. We're so glad he's here, and I want to be sure let our people know that Cecil Williams is the pastor emeritus and still working at the Glide Church in San Francisco. And Nigel Riley, the late Nigel Riley, was a legendary church administrator who brought a lot to bear regarding race and racism. But, Dr. Lawson, you've mentioned a couple of times the Southeast jurisdiction. There were 4 other jurisdictions, as well as the central jurisdiction, that bastion of segregation. Dr. Lawson, what were the other 4 geographic jurisdictions doing that would allow one jurisdiction to have that kind of power and influence?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay. You were saying that the Southeast jurisdiction helped to wipe out those 15 or 20 staff positions.
Yes, because
jurisdictions, what were they doing?
I have never really studied the minutes of that general conference in the 60s where this happened. I'm assuming that the church was saying that there were financial issues and were cutting budgets out of the notion that budgets had to be cut. And so the youth department and student department were almost completely wiped out. So I'm assuming there was a financial crunch. There should not have been a financial crunch in the 60s. But you know how often in general conference a financial crunch becomes the biggest topic, not evangelism or mission, and not the church having integrity. But the finances becomes the biggest issue. I mean, the number of general conferences I've gone to as a delegate, where of course money was the big issue. So I'm assuming that however that happened in the 60s, and whichever general conference it was under the rubric of the financial crunch of the church. But a church that is growing is always having a crunch.
Yes. Indeed.
Financing is always an issue.
Indeed. With that sort of thing going on, you made the decision that you heard a call from God and decided to be a Methodist clergyman. What made you decide to be a Methodist clergyman and enter into this faith and this fight this way?
Well, I hadn't given much thought to that. I think that in the course of my childhood and youth, I wanted to be a pastor of a church, and I was going to stay in the Methodist tradition. My father had transferred into the central jurisdiction when I was in the 3rd grade. In fact, just before the year I went into the 3rd grade, he had transferred in the central jurisdiction. So that's when I became connected with the Methodist Church.
Okay.
And by the time I was in high school, I knew that I was going to be a pastor, that's what I wanted to be, and that's where I could best work in following Jesus. So I didn't do any weighing of issues over that. That to me was a call, and I just expected to be able to fulfill that call.
Okay. That was your call. You fulfilled that call. Now,
Yeah.
in that call, you have been an ardent Jesus follower who also was a human rights, civil rights activist. Talk about that some when so many in the present United Methodist Church want to make a distinction and division between religion and what they call politics.
Well, they're out of their cotton picking minds. That's the way I put it. Because you cannot read the four gospels. You cannot read and try to study what Jesus was about without recognizing that the central commandment that Jesus um, talked about, well, 12th chapter of Mark, and experiences in both Matthew and Luke as well. 12th chapter of Mark, Jesus is asked in the temple court by a scribe, what is the first commandment? And Jesus, because that was an important issue in the first century Judaism, it was an important issue to Jesus. What is the first commandment? Teacher, what is the first commandment? And Jesus said, the first commandment is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. He said, there is no other commandment greater than these. And as I have continued to think and read and study, I am convinced that that's the central commandment that Jesus gave.
Mm-hmm.
His message was not as much about salvation as it was what kind of people ought we to be in the light of God's great gift of life and gift of love. So
Mm-hmm.
in any way, if that is true and that's consistent with the Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew prophets and with Moses, then politics is not about who gets elected or who makes a lot of money. Politics is about how people learn to live together with access to the gift of life and therefore with access to truth and justice and human community. And so I'm quite convinced that there is no other issue of the gospel besides that command of Jesus. So Christians, followers of Jesus, are supposed to be engaged in the politics of Jesus, in the politics of God, not the politics of racism, and not the politics of greed, and not the politics of the United States. So Christians are supposed to be becoming the people of God who want the will of God on earth as it is in heaven,
Mm.
which is what the Lord's Prayer says again and again. So those Christians who want to create a distinction among some people who you not supposed to connect with, they need to get out of the church because there's no room for that in Jesus. Jesus was accused of fraternizing with sinners, of having meals with people who were on the margins of life, who did not matter. So he was accused of associating with women in public life where he had no business doing so. So how anyone can pretend that there's some group of sinners that you don't connect to, I don't know, because you can't find that in Jesus.
Mm.
You can't find that in the four Gospels.
Mm. When you talk about Jesus and this politics being relationship and move and that toward life, when you talk about that toward life, and Jesus talk more about our relating than about what we call salvation eschatology. When you talk about life that way, life and truth, what are you defining as life that way? How would you speak of that spiritually, theologically, intellectually?
I would maintain that the book of Exodus and the life of Jesus have a major connection. In the book of Exodus, God calls people to leave slavery and journey their lives towards the promised land. That is, journey towards creating a place that is home and beloved community where God's will becomes primary concern. Jesus preaches the kingdom of God and says, "Follow me," which I maintain is a metaphor for moving to the promised land. So it's my thesis that salvation is not the primary teaching of the Bible or of Jesus. The primary teaching of the Bible is how God, over a 1,500-year period, encounters different generations of people, primarily Jewish people, people who formed themselves into Judaism, who become the people of God, and God constantly pushing that people in the scriptures to hear me and follow me, do my will on earth. And in the case of Jesus, I maintain his primary teaching was the kingdom of God, not are you saved? And I further insist that out of the Romanization of Jesus in the first, second, third, fourth, fifth centuries and beyond, this quality of Jesus's message was taken out. And the are you saved thing and go into the world and make disciples of all nations then became the substitutes. But that's my thesis, which I am prepared in different ways to defend. So I maintain, therefore, that in the 21st century, a major task for the church is its own reformation, its own transformation from being the folk who have the superior religion, who ask the sinner, "Are you saved? Are you a believer?" to sensing God's call is how you become a follower of Jesus, and how you become allied with God in turning the earth into the beloved community as is in heaven. And some of my favorite theologians of Jesus, that is, they've specialized in study of Jesus and written about it. Some of them have given me great hope over the last 60 years, because they've written books in which they've said that heaven is in good order. It's under the reign of God, that it's the earth that hasn't yet decided to become like heaven that is the problem. And maybe that's God's problem, because maybe God had no business creating us human beings in the image and likeness of God and expecting us then to grasp the heavens as an illustration of what earth itself can become.
Dr. Lawson, which Christological theologians have spoken to you about that? If you were to name one or two, who would you name and why?
Well, any number of folk, would concur with what I'm saying. But two, I could name 3 or 4 people who I've learned. Well, I've learned from a lot of scholars now. I read Karl Barth,
Right.
in the 50s and 60s, called the major theologian of the Christianity of the 20th century. But the people you've asked me specifically, people who say this, and in specific words, well, Karl Barth says it in his own way, but wraps it up in much more theological and dogmatic language. But on the other side, Marcus Borg um, um, has reiterated what I've said in many different ways. So has John Dominic Crossan, a Roman Catholic New Testament Jesus scholar. I'm trying to think of the author of a very nice book called Rabbi Jesus. Oh, I'm astonished that his name slips me now. But the book Rabbi Jesus, a new scholar who's probably still alive and still teaching out in the East, in a college in New York, as I remember. So those are 3 or 4 different people. But of course, my chief witness is the New Testament and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Not the writings of Paul, because Paul can be called the founder of Christianity. But those 4 Gospels, as I have studied them over and over and over again and read them almost daily, or quote them almost daily if I don't read it daily, confirms in me that Jesus was preaching the kingdom of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that this is his chief teaching, not some salvation religion. But Jesus assumes that if you follow Jesus, your life is going to be transformed. Your life is going to keep on being transformed. God's going to show you ways of becoming that you did not imagine was available. So I'm not trying to dismiss personal and social transformation. They're critical. That's what Jesus' phrase "follow me" represents.
Mm-hmm.
But the life of Jesus itself, as portrayed in the 4 Gospels, gives me that confirmation of turning earth into heaven is a primary purpose of Jesus and the will of God.
Yes, sir. When you speak of earth, turning earth to heaven, and followers of Jesus of Nazareth, where do you see the church now in following that theological spiritual bent? And if the church is not seeking the kingdom of God, what has turned the church away from seeking the kingdom of God and its focus on personal salvation?
Well, I think the romanization of Jesus's message and the Europeanization of Jesus's message turned the Jesus life away from what is I find in the Bible to then this dogmatic approach about religion and salvation. But I think in the United States, the development of the Christian nationalist movement out of the 19th century into the 20th century, and especially that development of the 20th century, is what has misshaped the church and Christianity in the 21st century.
Hmm. Has misshaped it.
Misshaped, yes, has contorted the scriptures. I mean, as an example, the prosperity church in the United States is a distortion of Jesus. It is one of the highly popular forms that religion has taken, that Christianity has taken in the United States. It's transactional religion. You bless God and God gives you prosperity and God blesses you in various. So transactional religion. So I think 20th century USA religion has greatly distorted who Jesus is and what Jesus was, at least as we see him in the New Testament.
This transactional religion that is that ignores, at least to some extent, transformation, transformation of the world, transformation of people. How do you see the movement toward the mega church in that regard?
Well, most of the mega churches are churches connected to this prosperity religion and to Christian nationalism rather than to the gospel of Jesus. I'll just say that bluntly. And I've done some study of that. I went back to Vanderbilt to work on a doctorate of Christian ministry for a sabbatical back in the early 1970s, and studied Billy Graham and the whole evangelical movement. That was my course of study, to just see that wing of Christianity in the United States. So I've done some following of that over the years through my own reading and study.
Okay.
It is a distortion of Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, indeed. Shift a little bit. You may have seen or heard about the show, the fiasco, the uneventful event last night that was called a debate.
Yes, I saw portions of it. I had to leave.
Yeah, I understand. One of the nominees has certainly grabbed a portion of what we call the church. He took a Bible and stood in front of a church with it, etc.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think or see as we look? This is Wednesday Wellness, brothers and sisters. If you have questions for Dr. Lawson, we're going to go to those in just a moment. If you have any questions, please post them in the feed. Dr. Lawson, what do you say? What has happened with a church and pastoral leaders who embraced one who last night clearly said, or clearly did not say, that he would condemn white supremacy? In fact, one person today said he didn't condemn it, he commanded it.
Mm-hmm.
What happens? What has happened in the church, one, that would embrace that? Secondly, and more importantly, in my view, to a church that's silent to his behavior. What do you say to that, Dr. Lawson?
In large measure, that wing of Christianity in the United States comes from the same wing that supported slavery for 250 years. That has to be understood. And that wing of the church was greatly shattered by the Civil War, abolishing slavery
Mm.
because they were very much into slavery is legitimate, it's the will of God, so forth and so on. Civil War, therefore, said no slavery, and it's wrong. It's not legal. It's not constitutional. And that crushed a lot of Christians in their belief of the Bible. Now, some of them pretended in the 19th century that it was Charles um, Darwin's discovery of evolution that threatened the Bible. But I maintain that that's not true. It was the Civil War's victory over slavery that shattered largely the white church in many parts of the country, but especially in southeastern and the south central part of the country.
Oh my.
And from that, they've never recovered.
Oh my.
So they are the ones who then moved from having supported slavery to then supporting the development of a racist, segregated system of life, economically, spiritually, and otherwise. So those are the same groups that in United Methodist Church today are battling over gay lesbian issues.
Mm-hmm.
They're the same people. So I maintain that it is this issue of slavery and racism which this group that supports our current president in office, they're really about wanting to be the dominant people in human history in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, the whole breakup of slavery, and now the breakup of segregation, and now the whole discussion of how do we move ourselves from being a racist country to being a country rooted in our historical documents, especially the philosophy and theology and spirituality of the preamble of the Declaration of Independence and the preamble of the Constitution of the United States, which for me are almost like scripture because they really call us to confession and to faith.
Oh my.
and 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 they're trying to, they want not just to go back, they don't want to go back. Maybe some of them know they cannot go back, but what they want to do is frame the future that will be another representative nation and church like that old system.
Oh yes. Okay.
uh, uh, the Supreme Court has been programmed. Some people say it's an effort to go back, but there's no going backwards. I don't care if the Supreme Court does abolish Roe Wade and affordable health care. We, the people of the USA, are not going back to the 19th century or to 1945. We're not going back to that society. The genie is out of the bottle.
Oh my, sir. You cannot put the toothpaste back in the tube, can you?
And it's not going to be. It's not going. We're not going back. We're not going to put up signs again at Harvey's department store in Nashville, white-colored drinking fountains. It's not going to happen.
Yes, sir. All right.
But they're trying to find the new representation of that in government.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
How they can continue this dominating unhealthy religion into the 21st century.
Yes.
And I'm going to say that they're probably going to be unlucky because they're not going to find a way of reassembling Humpty Dumpty who's fallen off the wall and shattered into many pieces. They're not going to be able to put that shell back together again.
Amen, sir. Amen.
They're going to cause a lot of damage, going to hurt a lot of people, especially they're going to continue to want to produce poverty in our nation and hurt poor people.
Yes.
And this group of people have no concern for the fact that poverty embraces more white children than any other group in our country, because white people make up over 200 million people in our country. Poverty of 10% or 15% of the nation means that the white community has far more children who are suffering hunger and whatnot and are hidden, and they don't care. I mean, this is one of the issues that I maintain is so important. They don't care about people, because the children of poverty who are white represents the largest group of children in the country, and the white community of the churches seem not even to make them visible.
Yes, sir. Not
the black church has helped to make poverty visible.
Yes, sir. Yes,
But
sir.
the nation hasn't understood at all yet that while black poverty is disproportionate because of racism and the structures of racism, the white community still suffers the greatest amount of illiteracy and ill health across the nation. Indians have the worst health in our nation, but white people have the largest number of people who suffer ill health without medical care.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. We got a question.
And they have no white voices demanding at the local level, the state level, the national level, that this is going to end.
How do we reframe the politics of the church for that kind of end to happen? How do we reframe the politics of the church toward the gospel teachings of Jesus that you just raised, that would have a dent in this poverty and in this racism? That's one of our questions.
Well, I think I'm going to start over. How do I best do that? Well, many of us in the black church have been framing this and reframing this over and over again. And it's clear, if we watch this coming election, black people will overwhelmingly vote against Donald Trump. Overwhelmingly. We have our first racist in the White House. The first figure who absolutely represents everything that we know is wrong. So I expect an overwhelming black vote saying no to Donald Trump.
Yeah, certainly.
One way of dealing with this is to recognize the black church has historically been opposed to white politics that has rejected us. So one thing that we can do is do a better job of structuring the black church agenda.
Oh my!
Do a better job of doing it. Black church politics come out of the slavery of 250 years, where the slave overwhelmingly knew that slavery was wrong. Overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
The huge library of music that came out of the years of slavery testify to that. They knew slavery was wrong.
Yeah.
So the black agenda has largely, from my point of view, come out of the slave sense that slavery is wrong, and we're going to fight every vestige of it, and we will not be satisfied until every ounce of it is defeated everywhere across this country. So the black church codifying that and structuring it even more would be a healthy way for us to proceed in the 21st century.
Thank you, sir. I got another question. This is from my bride, actually, but very important. With the bullhorn discussion from Donald Trump on last evening relative to the Proud Boys and racism, violence. I've heard you say this before. The United States of America is the most violent nation in the history of the planet Earth. How, sir, with all this violence going, and there seeming to be no conscience relative to it, how do you think nonviolent direct social action can be effective, or can it be effective today?
Well, the BLM movement has involved some 15 to 25 million people in every state of the union, almost 8,000 demonstrations in 2,400 locations. It's the largest such movement we've ever had, and it is largely a nonviolent movement. Some studies that have appeared in the Washington Post just in the last month indicate that the violence represents no more than 8 or 9% at most of what's going on in the street today. But the media and the president plays up the violence in such a way that you would never know that reading about Portland today, or reading about Seattle, or reading about Louisville, Kentucky. There are differences, of course, but I maintain that the violence is less than 8 or 9% at the most in the streets, and that the BLM campaign is largely the most effective nonviolent campaign, and it's an evolutionary campaign because it has moved deeper and deeper into the issue of dismantling racism in all its various forms and allowing the new ways of living together to emerge. And its central issue now is, of course, the violence against Black people, historic, 400 years of it, and has been expressed so much in the 20th century by the police violence.
Mm.
I maintain that movement has been very, very effective in laying that issue on the table. So it's another advancement for desegregation.
So you're of the opinion that nonviolence can still be effective even in this profoundly violent time?
More than that, I maintain two or three things. One, if Western civilization continues the path of violence around the world, it will destroy the planet and the human race. Secondly, that violence itself is ineffectual. Go look in Central Asia. Go look in Iraq. Go look in the Middle East. Go look in Libya. Go look in Syria. Go look in Sudan. Go look in Africa, where the United States has now 6,000 troops in 43 countries.
Mm.
The intention of the United States policy will be that Africa will become the next Iraq, Libya. We want the oil, we want the diamonds, we want the wealth to continue from Africa to pour into the United States, and we're not taking no for an answer. So violence is ineffectual, is the tool of those who want to dominate and manage and control, and who do not want the emancipation of human life across the face of our nation. And so the question is not, is nonviolent effective? The question is violence effective? Has violence in the racist system benefited us Black people? Does violence against us give us justice or safe streets? or protects our land, our property? No, of course not. The big question is not is nonviolent can be effective. It's been effective in bringing us thus far. The question is, when will we give up our romantic love of violence?
Oh my. Hmm. Hmm.
What?
What proactive strategy, and this is another question from the audience, what proactive strategies can we execute for positive change to benefit all of humanity?
Well, I maintain we can't benefit all of humanity as long as we are essentially an unjust plantation capitalist society. Until we change our own society, there can be no positive change for all of humanity. But I want to, however, say that the folk who are demonstrating positive change for all humankind is a whole part of Europe. The part of the world that's showing the world, the human race, how we can live together is Europe. Europe generally has the highest standard of living. Europe in the last 30, 40 years have virtually wiped out illiteracy by putting their emphasis upon education and quality education for all. Europe has a quality access to health care for every European. So they are living longer and better and healthier than we are. So the nation, the area of the human race that is showing the world how we ought to live is not the United States, but Europe. Europe is the place where, when babies are born in almost every country, there is universal health care available for them. And the new parents can get all kinds of family help for the care of that baby in the first 6 months or the first year or the first 3 years. The budgets are geared towards the families and towards the baby. So United States no longer is the example of human life in the world. And they haven't been for 30 or 40 years. This business about we lead a nation in the kind of life, that's nonsense. That's nonsense. For a long time, 40, 50, 60 years, Western Europe especially, has been developing societies where people have access to the tree of life. And that tells me the kingdom of God on earth is not a hallucination.
Mm.
That Jesus is correct. Where people now, the Sweden hasn't tried to pretend that this is the will of God, but Sweden has created a government that is humanistic and embraces all the people.
Oh my.
So that's a illustration of where I don't think we're setting the example for the human race at this stage of the game, and we cannot because our own society is far too corrupt.
Speaking to that corruption, we don't have a lot of time left. Speaking to that corruption, I don't want to get away from this time without something you mentioned earlier. The church has found a way now to make LGBTQIA persons a standard for segregating, for putting off or putting down. But there's been some pushback. What would you like to say to that issue relative to racism and segregation?
You're saying about the struggle in the UMC
Yes,
around the issue of GLBTQ?
yes, sir.
Yeah. In the first instance, my own thesis is that the forces primarily out of the southeastern jurisdiction, that has been pushing that issue, have substituted that issue for their not dealing with their racism. In many ways, the King Rosa Parks movement caused white segregationists in the church to stop using bad language about black people publicly. The evangelical groups on the radios stopped using racism in their sermons. Jerry Falwell, and one of the great evangelists of that tradition. So I maintain that when we force them to stop publicly declaring themselves as segregationists, they chose the GLBTQ issue as their substitute. So I maintain that they're really dishonest people.
Oh my.
Some of them I have known for 50 years, Vance. I've known him for, yes, that's right. I've known him since the 60s, the 50s.
Oh my.
And I consider them very dishonest people who basically have prospered as church people and have substituted their prosperity for Jesus and the religion of Jesus.
My goodness. All right, sir.
Can you imagine the plight we're in today? A whole large group of people in the United Methodist Church are wrestling with how they can divide and leave the church over the issue of a group of people in the church who represent less than 3% of the membership of the church.
Oh my.
They're not wrestling over how do we follow Jesus in the 21st century. They're wrestling over how can we divide the church.
How do we exclude?
And that, of course, is we're not just exclude. We're going to cut this United Methodist Church up into parts over this issue.
Right. Indeed.
And that represents their fear and hatred, does not represent anything of Jesus.
Thank you, sir. One last question. How do you suggest bringing back the youth and college students to the church? Youth and college students who are largely leading the new civil rights struggle, that is the Black Lives Matter movement.
Well, reestablish some Methodist-like structures to reach them and to evangelize them. And they are no longer open to a dogmatic creedal religion. They are going to really be only open to a religion of Jesus, like Jesus, that is about compassion and love and truth and justice and beauty, not about dogma or creed, and about following Jesus. So they can be brought back into, they can be invited into the church in a fashion that will have them join in large numbers, if we wish.
All right. Thank you, sir. This has been wonderful. The book you talked about, Rabbi Jesus, the author of that book, was that author Bruce Chilton?
That's right. A wonderful New Testament scholar. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Bridget Young Ross and Dr. Wendell Love both came up with that while we were talking.
Yeah.
Dr. Lawson,
Bruce Chilton.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Dr.
Yeah.
Lawson, would you have some closing remarks to our audience, to our people, to the people at Central Church and beyond?
Well, I think with this pandemic and the the seemingly inability of the United States to offer health care or to offer a way of limiting the pandemic, the gospel of Jesus, the religion of Jesus, as Howard Thurman put it, has more power to transform and to heal than ever before. And so it seems to me to be very critical for Central Church to work on that religion of Jesus and to see how, therefore, you can offer it in Atlanta. Atlanta also is a large city with many people who are wandering like sheep without a shepherd. So there's rich opportunities, I think, in a place like Atlanta and a place like Los Angeles. So it seems to me that's our task in the 21st century. So I'm very grateful for what I see in my friend Vance Ross and that congregation. And I urge you to the continuing discovery of the way in this year 2020. Thank Vance a lot for the opportunities he's given me.
Dr. Lawson, thank you so very much. The Central Church thanks you very much. Sisters and brothers, this is Wednesday Wellness. We're closing out, and we're so very, very grateful to have you. Dr. Lawson, again, thank you so very much. We will continue to be in touch. Again, dear brothers and sisters, it's our hope that you have found some hope, you have found some help, you found some faith and some fellowship in this time. We want to be sure that in this time of the COVID pandemic, and as we continue with the white supremacy racist pandemic, that we are becoming a people and sharing with people the good news of the gospel of Jesus of Nazareth, and that gospel frees people, liberates them to the bringing of the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. On behalf of all the good people at the Central United Methodist Church, I thank all of you for being here with us tonight. Look forward to seeing you next Wednesday, and this coming Sunday, virtual worship is at 10 o'clock. It is World Communion Sunday, and we look forward to seeing you there, being there with us as we celebrate World Communion with all the peoples of the world. Thank you again so very, very much. You take good care. Keep the faith. Be safe. Wear your mask. As always, be well. Bye now.